This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 24, Chapter 12, The Republican in the Ruins. The heathen in his blindness bows down to wood and stone, especially to a wood-cut or a lithographic stone. Modern people put their trust in pictures, especially scientific pictures, as much as the most superstitious ever put it in religious pictures. They publish a portrait of the missing link as if he were the missing man for whom the police are always advertising, for all the world as if the anthropoid had been photographed before he absconded. The scientific diagram may be a hypothesis, it may be a fancy, it may be a forgery, but it is always an idol in the true sense of an image, and an image in the true sense of a thing mastering the imagination and not the reason. The power of these talismanic pictures is almost hypnotic to modern humanity. We can never forget that we have seen a portrait of the missing link, though we should instantly detect the lapse of logic into superstition if we were told that the old Greek agnostics had made a statue of the unknown God. But there is still a stranger fashion in which we fall victims to the same trick of fancy. We accept in a blind and literal spirit not only images of speculation, but even figures of speech. The 19th century prided itself on having lost its faith in myths, and proceeded to put all its faith in metaphors. It dismissed the old doctrines about the way of life and the light of the world, and then it proceeded to talk as if the light of truth were really and literally a light that could be absorbed by merely opening our eyes, or as if the path of progress were really and truly a path to be found by merely following our noses. Thus the purpose of God is an idea, true or false, but the purpose of nature is merely a metaphor. For obviously if there is no God there is no purpose. Yet while men by an imaginative instinct spoke of the purpose of God with a grand agnosticism, as something too large to be seen, something reaching out to worlds and to eternities, they speak of the purpose of nature in particular, and practical problems of curing babies or cutting up rabbits. This power of the modern metaphor must be understood by way of an introduction, if we are to understand one of the chief errors, at once evasive and pervasive, which perplex the problem of America. America is always spoken of as a young nation, and whether or no this be a valuable and suggestive metaphor, very few people notice that it is a metaphor at all. If somebody said that a certain deserving charity had just gone into trousers, we should recognise that it was a figure of speech, and perhaps a rather surprising figure of speech. If somebody said that a daily paper had recently put its hair up, we should know it could only be a metaphor, and possibly a rather strained metaphor. Yet these phrases would mean the only thing that can possibly be meant by calling a corporate association of all sorts of people young. That is, that a certain institution has only existed for a certain time. I am not now denying that such a corporate nationality may happen to have a psychology comparatively analogous to the psychology of youth. I am not even denying that America has it. I am only pointing out to begin with that we must first free ourselves from the talismanic tyranny of a metaphor which we do not recognise as a metaphor. Men realise that the old mystical doctrines were mystical. They do not realise that the new metaphors are metaphorical. They have some sort of hazy notion that American society must be growing, must be promising, must have the virtues of hope and the fault of ignorance, merely because it has only had a separate existence since the 18th century. And that is exactly like saying that a new chapel must be growing taller, or that a limited liability company will soon have its second teeth. Now, in truth, this particular conception of American hopefulness would be anything but hopeful for America, if the argument really were, as it's still vaguely supposed to be, that America must have a long life before it, because it only started in the 18th century. We should find a very fatal answer by looking at other political systems that did start in the 18th century. The 18th century was called the Age of Reason, and there is a very real sense in which the other systems were indeed started in a spirit of reason. But starting from reason has not saved them from ruin. If we survey the Europe of today with real clarity and historic comprehension, we shall see that it is precisely the most recent and the most rationalistic creations that have been ruined. The two great states which did most definitely and emphatically deserve to be called modern states were Prussia and Russia. There was no real Prussia before Frederick the Great, no real Russian Empire before Peter the Great. Both those innovators recognized themselves as rationalists, bringing a new reason and order into an indeterminate barbarism, and doing for the barbarians what the barbarians could not do for themselves. They did not, like the kings of England or France or Spain or Scotland, inherit a sceptre that was the symbol of a historic and patriotic people. In this sense there was no Russia, but only an Emperor of Russia. In this sense Prussia was a kingdom before it was a nation, if ever it was a nation. But anyhow, both men were particularly modern in their whole mood and mind. They were modern to the extent of being not only anti-traditional, but almost anti-patriotic. Peter forced the science of the West on Russia, to the regret of many Russians. Frederick talked the French of Voltaire and not the German of Luther. The two experiments were entirely in the spirit of Voltairean rationalism. They were built in broad daylight by men who believed in nothing but the light of common day, and already their day is done. If then the promise of America were in the fact that she is one of the latest births of progress, we should point out that it is exactly the latest born that were the first to die. If in this sense she is praised as young, it may be answered that the young have died young, and have not lived to be old. And if this be confused with the argument that she came in an age of clarity and scepticism, uncontaminated by old superstitions, it could still be retorted that the works of superstition have survived the works of scepticism. But the truth is, of course, that the real quality of America is much more subtle and complex than this, and is mixed not only of good and bad, and rational and mystical, but also of old and new. That is what makes the task of tracing the true proportions of American life so interesting and so impossible. To begin with, such a metaphor is always as distracting as a mixed metaphor. It is a double-edged tool that cuts both ways, and consequently opposite ways. We use the same word young to mean two opposite extremes. We mean something at an early stage of growth, and also something having the latest fruits of growth. We might call a commonwealth young if it conducted all its daily conversation by wireless telegraphy, meaning that it was progressive. But we might also call it young if it conducted all its industry with chipped flints, meaning that it was primitive. These two meanings of youth are hopelessly mixed up when the word is applied to America. But what is more curious, the two elements really are wildly entangled in America. America is in some ways what is called in advance of the times, and in some ways what is called behind the times. But it seems a little confusing to convey both notions by the same word. On the one hand, Americans often are successful in the last inventions, and for that very reason they are often neglectful of the last but one. It is true of men in general, dealing with things in general, that while they are progressing in one thing, such as science, they are going back in another thing, such as art. What is less fully realized is that this is true even as between different methods of science. The perfection of wireless telegraphy might well be followed by the gross imperfection of wires. The very enthusiasm of American science brings this out very vividly. The telephone in New York works miracles all day long. Replies from remote places come as promptly as in